The arguments you're going to be dealing with in your thought primer are not the simple kinds of arguments that we've been looking at in these previous lectures. They're not going to be arguments that come to you already reduced down to their symbolic forms with individual letters representing our terms. Instead, these arguments that you're going to be contending with are ordinary language arguments. They're going to be arguments that are comprised of real words like the ones that I'm using right now. And when working those with ordinary language arguments, it can be really easy to make mistakes and get kind of lost and confused. So we want to have a very sensible, methodical process for dealing with these problems. And that's what we're going to go over here. So I want you to take really careful notes of the steps that we go through here to contend with a particular argument, because those are the same steps that you should be using when you do your homework problems. It's the surest way to make sure that you don't have a super frustrating experience when you're working on your thought primer. All right, so here's our argument. All homework problems are impossible problems. Some homework problems are frustrating problems. Therefore, some frustrating problems are not possible problems. Now, the very first thing we're always going to do is we're going to identify the premise and conclusion statements. Okay? Now here, that's really easy. Your homework problems will be a little harder. But here, that's really easy because this argument's being presented to us very formally, where we have the inference bar that indicates to us that the top two statements are our premises and the final statement is our conclusion. The next thing we want to do is we want to identify the terms, and we want to do this in a really particular way. When we identify terms, we want to start with the first premise and move from left to right and look very carefully at the terms as we go to the second premise and the third premise, because you'd be surprised how common it is for folks to not look really carefully at the wording and they miss a term complement in one of the terms, and then all the work they do with that argument is flawed from that point forward. So in this particular argument, we've got homework problems and impossible problems and frustrating problems and possible problems. 4 terms, which is obviously one too many to be considered standard form. So we got to reduce the number of terms down to 4, and fortunately, we got to reduce the terms down to 3. And fortunately, it's really easy to identify a couple of term complements here. We've got impossible problems and possible problems, and these are sort of two sides of the same coin. Now, we could choose P to represent possible problems, and then anytime we wanted to mention our impossible problems, we could just say non-P. Or we could choose I to represent impossible problems, and then anytime we wanted to say possible problems, we just say non-I. Now, neither one of those is technically incorrect, but I would suggest to you that there's something really counterintuitive about using I here. Because if I wanted to tell you that something was possible, and I said to you, hey, you know what? This is non-impossible. You'd be like, wait, what? It's non-impossible? Didn't you just mean it's possible? Yeah. So I would suggest that anytime you're presented with this, that you don't choose terms that are going to require you to do something counterintuitive when using the term complement. And that means for this argument, we're going to use P as our term. All right, so now we've got to translate this argument into symbols, and to do that, we'll say all H are non-P. All homework problems are non-possible or impossible problems. Some H are F, and some F are not P. Once we've done that, we've got to reduce down the number of terms of this argument, and we can do that by getting rid of this non in the first premise with aversion. If we avert all H are non-P, we're going to wind up with the statement no H or P. And now suddenly we are down to 3 terms in our argument. And that's good news for us because now we can start to do things with this argument. We're going to want to make sure, though, that the argument is in standard form. And what that means is we're going to take a pause. We're going to identify our major term, which is the predicate of the conclusion. We're going to make sure it appears somewhere up here in the first premise, which it does. And we're going to make sure that our minor premise, the subject of the conclusion, appears somewhere here in the second premise, and it does. And that we have our middle term up here. So we make sure we've got 3 terms that appear 2 times each in exactly the same way. That guarantees that the work we do going forward is going to be on a standard form categorical syllogism. And now we can determine its form. Okay, so the form of this particular argument, we have an E, we have an I, and we have an O. E, I, O is the mood, and we see the middle term is right over here in the subject position of both premises. That tells us this is an E, I, O in figure 3. I can consult my unconditionally valid inventory, and I look under figure 3, and looky-loo. It's right there. That tells me this argument is valid. Now, I'm always going to want to make sure that I double check my work, okay? If I want to use Venn diagrams, great. If I want to use the 5 rules, great. Do whatever you prefer. You just want to make sure that you're always checking your work by determining validity in 2 ways. Personally, I like to use the 5 rules because it's so fast, right? So I identify my distributed terms. I have H and P distributed in the first premise and P distributed in the conclusion. And then I just run through the 5 rules. The middle term needs to be distributed one time. H is our middle term and it's distributed right here in the first premise. If there's anything distributed in the conclusion, says rule number 2, then it better be distributed in a premise. And it is. You can't have 2 negative premises, and we don't. But if you do have a negative premise, you better have a negative conclusion, and we do. 5th rule doesn't apply because we don't have 2 universal premises. Now I've checked the argument by applying the 5 rules. It violated none of them. Any categorical syllogism that doesn't violate or break the 5 rules for categorical syllogisms is a valid argument. So I've proven this argument valid by carefully following these steps. And these are the steps that we're going to actually use in the next lecture to deal with a really complicated argument.